Welcome back to the front lines of justice. I'm Harper Vance. Today we're looking at the story of Captain Julia Dean, the mastermind behind Fort Liberty's elite cyber defense unit. She spent 15 years building the shield that kept her soldiers safe. But what happens when the enemy isn't a foreign power, but your own flesh and blood? When a jealous colonel, who happens to be Julia's own sister, orchestrates a betrayal to destroy her career, she inadvertently triggers a deadly blackout that leaves the entire base defenseless. Julia was stripped of her rank, but she's about to prove that while you can take the uniform, you can never take the power. This is the story of how the outcast became the savior. Let's dive in. The briefing room at Fort Liberty was swallowed by a silence so thick it felt like it had its own weight. It was not the comfortable silence of a team in deep thought, but the sterile, freezing quiet that precedes a disaster. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my hands still hovering near the projector, where I had just finished presenting my report on a 40% increase in defensive efficiency. I had spent 6 months on those logistics, pouring every ounce of my experience into a system that would keep our people safe. But as I looked across the table at Colonel Vanessa Kincaid, my own sister, I realized the data did not matter. Vanessa was not looking at the screen. She was looking at me with a cold, predatory focus that made the air in the room feel thin. She began to tap her manicured fingernail against the wood, a rhythmic, sharp sound that echoed like the ticking of a countdown clock. 12 senior officers sat like statues along the sides of the room, their faces unreadable, though I could see the tension in the set of their shoulders. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioner like a blade. She did not call me Julia. She did not even look at me as a human being. She called me Captain Dean, using the rank she was about to strip away to create a distance that felt like a chasm. She told me my report was trash and accused me of a level 4 security violation, a charge so absurd and fabricated that for a moment I thought I had misheard her. But the look in her eyes was unmistakable. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She demanded my sidearm and my identification immediately. It was a public execution of my career, orchestrated by the person who shared my blood. The shock was a physical sensation, a sudden coldness that started in my chest and radiated outward until my fingers felt numb. I had served 15 years in the military, climbing the ranks through grit and sacrifice, and in 5 minutes, it was being erased. I reached for the Sig Sauer P320 at my hip, my movements slow and deliberate. The sound of the holster clicking open was deafening in that silent room. When the heavy metal of the pistol hit the mahogany table, it made a sharp, final sound that seemed to signal the end of my life as I knew it. Then came the pins. I reached up and unclipped the silver oak leaves from my shoulders. Those small pieces of metal represented every sleepless night, every deployment, and every bit of my identity. Now, they were just scrap metal lying on a table in front of a woman who wanted to see me break. I looked into Vanessa's eyes, searching for even a flicker of the sister I used to know. I wanted to see a moment of hesitation or a hint of the childhood we shared. Instead, I saw a faint, twisted smile. It was a private expression, one meant only for me to see, and it transported me back decades to the day she had reached out and snapped the head off my favorite doll just to see me cry. She was not acting out of duty or military necessity. She was indulging in a lifelong need to diminish my value because she could never quite reach it herself. She told me to leave her base, calling me a former captain with a tone of voice that was meant to be the ultimate insult. I felt the sting of humiliation, a hot flush of shame that threatened to overwhelm my professional mask. I gathered the few personal items I had in a small cardboard box, my spine stiff and my head held high despite the hollow ache in my gut. I turned my back on the mahogany table and the sister who had betrayed me, walking toward the door with the weight of 15 lost years pressing down on my shoulders. But as I reached the handle, the silence of the room was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy sound of chairs sliding back against the floor. I stopped and turned around. Sergeant Briggs was the first to stand. Then came Rivera, then Daniels. One by one, the 22 soldiers of the Cyber Defense Unit, the people I had trained and bled with, stood up in a silent, collective defiance. Vanessa's face transformed from smug satisfaction to a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She began to scream, her voice cracking as she demanded they sit down, reminding them that this was not a marketplace and that they were under her command. But they did not even look at her. They ignored the colonel as if she were a ghost. They watched me instead, their expressions filled with a grim, unwavering loyalty that no rank could ever command. Without a word, they began to pack their gear, stripping off their headsets and gathering their belongings. They were not just leaving a room. They were choosing to walk away from their careers and their security because they refused to serve a leader who lacked honor. They were my chosen family. And in that moment, they were giving me back the dignity that my sister had tried to steal. As we walked out into the bright, unforgiving sun of the Fort Liberty parking lot, the atmosphere on the base felt different. Word had clearly spread through the digital grapevine. Soldiers from other units stopped what they were doing, standing at attention and offering a formal salute as our small, bedraggled group passed by. It was a display of respect that Vanessa, with all her power and manipulation, would never be able to earn. My breath hitched in my chest as the reality of the situation settled in. I was no longer a captain. I had no job, no clear future, and a family that had turned into a den of wolves. But as I stood by my car, Rivera stepped forward. He reached into his pack and pulled out a chipped ceramic mug with the words, "World's Okayest Captain," printed on the side, a running joke in our unit that now felt like a sacred relic. He handed it to me and told me that while the Army might not recognize my value anymore, his team always would. He said they followed the leader, not the rank on the shoulder. I felt the first hot tear slide down my cheek as I gripped the handle of that mug. The career I had built was gone, and the sister I had loved was a stranger. But as I looked at the 22 faces standing behind me, I realized that power was not something granted by a commission. It was something grown in the trenches of mutual respect. I watched the convoy of our personal vehicles begin to pull away from the gates, leaving a gaping hole in the command structure of Fort Liberty, and 1,000 questions about where we would go next. The drive to my parents' house in Hope Mills was filled with a fragile, desperate kind of hope that I knew was dangerous. I wanted to believe that despite everything Vanessa had done at the base, the four walls of my childhood home would still offer some kind of sanctuary. As I pulled into the driveway, the familiar scent of slow-roasted beef and cinnamon apple pie wafted through the vents of my car, a sensory map of a time when life felt simpler. For a split second, the trauma of the morning at Fort Liberty felt like a bad dream that could be washed away by a home-cooked meal and a mother's hug. But the moment I stepped through the front door, the heavy air of the foyer told a different story. I looked toward the main wall in the living room, where our family history was displayed in mismatched frames. There was Vanessa, looking regal in her dress blues, her meritorious service medal glinting under a dedicated picture light in an expensive gold frame. It was the center of their universe. I moved my eyes to the spot where my own graduation photo from the academy used to hang, only to find a pale, rectangular ghost of dust on the wallpaper. My presence had been erased before I even walked through the door. My mother didn't greet me with open arms. Instead, she stood by the kitchen island, nervously wiping her hands on a floral apron, refusing to meet my gaze. Her first words weren't about how I was feeling or what had happened. She simply sighed and told me that Vanessa had called, and then she asked why I always had to make things so difficult for my sister. Dinner felt less like a meal and more like a carefully staged interrogation. My father, a man who still carried himself with the rigid, uncompromising posture of the Marine he used to be, sat at the head of the table. He cut into his steak with a mechanical, aggressive precision, the silver knife screeching against the fine china like a warning. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of forks. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard and judgmental. He told me he had heard about the scene I made in the briefing room and asked if I had any idea how hard my sister had worked to reach the rank of colonel. He accused me of trying to sabotage the family's reputation out of pure spite. I tried to keep my voice steady, explaining that I hadn't done anything wrong and that I was fired because my performance was highlighting Vanessa's own technical gaps. I told them I had 22 soldiers who walked out with me because they knew the truth. But my father didn't want the truth. He slammed his hand against the table, a sudden thunderous sound that made the wine glasses rattle and the red liquid splash across the white linen cloth like a fresh wound. He told me to stop with the excuses and called me a disgrace to the dean name, claiming I was just jealous of a sister who had actually achieved something. My mother played her usual role of the enabler, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that felt more poisonous than my father's rage. She suggested that I should just be sensible and take the olive branch Vanessa was offering. Vanessa had apparently told them she could arrange a quiet desk job for me in the logistics warehouse if I was willing to make a public apology for my insubordination. My mother even reached over to scoop more mashed potatoes onto my father's plate, completely ignoring my own empty dish as if I weren't even there. In their eyes, I wasn't the daughter who had served with honor. I was just a problem to be managed and tucked away so Vanessa's star could keep rising. Sitting there, watching them, I realized for the first time that Vanessa wasn't an accident. She was a product of this room, of this constant, unwavering devotion to the golden child at the expense of the one who actually did the work. This wasn't a home. It was a factory that manufactured my own unworthiness. I looked at the two people who had brought me into the world and realized they had never truly seen me, and they never would. They were more invested in the lie of a perfect family than the reality of their own child's suffering. The realization brought a strange, cold clarity to my mind. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. I told them I was full and that I wouldn't be apologizing for mistakes I didn't make. My mother looked up, startled, and asked where I was going since we hadn't even had dessert yet. I looked at her, then at my father, and told them I was going to find my real family, the people who didn't need me to have a specific rank to show me respect. I walked out of that house without looking back, even as my father's voice followed me out into the night, shouting about how I would never make it on my own. I got into my car and sat in the darkness for a moment, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I turned on the radio to drown out the sound of my own heart, and a preacher was speaking about the virtue of forgiveness. I turned it off. Tonight, I didn't need a sermon on turning the other cheek. I needed the strength to keep driving until that house was nothing more than a fading light in my rearview mirror. I was finally severing the cord, choosing a lonely road over a crowded table full of lies. And my heart truly aches for Julia in this moment. There is no sting quite like being treated as a stranger in your own childhood home, or having your hard-earned success used as a weapon against you by the very people who should be your biggest fans. It takes an incredible amount of courage to walk away from the only family you have ever known when they refuse to see your worth. If you have ever felt like the black sheep or the one who was always overlooked despite doing your best, please leave a heart emoji in the comments so Julia knows she is not alone. Your support means the world as we follow her journey toward finding where she truly belongs. Returning to my rented apartment was like stepping into a tomb of my own making. The silence here was different from the heavy, expectant quiet of Fort Liberty. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a complete isolation. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this space, from the creaky floorboard near the kitchen to the way the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows across the living room wall. I sat down at my small desk and opened my personal laptop, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed in the URL for the military benefits portal. I just needed to check my health insurance, a small anchor to hold onto in the storm. But when I hit enter, the screen didn't load my profile. Instead, a harsh, crimson box appeared in the center of the display with the words, "Access denied. User does not exist." It had only been 4 hours since I walked out of that briefing room. In that short window, Vanessa hadn't just fired me, she was systematically scrubbing my existence from the digital history of the United States Army. I tried the official base website, and there it was, the final blow to my pride. The change of command ceremony for the Cyber Defense Unit was already scheduled for the following morning, and my name was nowhere to be found. It was as if 15 years of deployments, commendations, and blood had never happened. I sat in the dark, bathed in the blue glow of the error message, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I reached for my copy of Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, a book that had guided me through the toughest missions. I focused on the idea of the reset. When you are surrounded and the walls are closing in, you find the smallest exit and you fight your way through it. The 2 a.m. knock on my door was so soft I almost missed it. My training took over instantly. I reached for my Sig Sauer, checking the chamber in one fluid motion before peering through the eye hole. Outside stood Sergeant Briggs, his face obscured by a dark hoodie, looking more like a common criminal than the disciplined soldier I knew. I pulled him inside quickly, the air from the hallway smelling of cold rain and adrenaline. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He threw a rugged, portable hard drive onto my coffee table and told me I needed to see what was on it. He explained that a technician named Connor Wells, one of Vanessa's most loyal hounds, had been deep in my server logs 2 days before the security violation ever occurred. As I plugged the drive into my machine and watched the lines of code scroll past, my heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. Briggs pointed out the authorization stamps. Every single entry of the fabricated violation was authorized using Vanessa's own common access card credentials. This wasn't a failure of my leadership or a mistake in my reporting. This was a meticulously planned execution, a digital trap laid by the woman who used to read me bedtime stories. The technical evidence was right there, buried in the metadata. Vanessa's arrogance had been her undoing. She was so certain I would just roll over and disappear that she hadn't bothered to properly hide the digital fingerprints of her betrayal. Before I could process the magnitude of the discovery, my phone vibrated on the table, displaying a number I didn't recognize. A sharp, authoritative woman's voice came through the line, telling me not to do anything stupid. It was Holly Whitman, the legendary civilian lawyer known for tearing through the red tape of the military justice system. Briggs had called her before coming to me. She warned me that the system was designed to protect people with stars on their shoulders, and if I went to the authorities now with just this drive, I would be crushed before I could take a second breath. She told me I needed to stop acting like an injured sister and start acting like a strategist. She said that to win this, I needed the original system logs from the base server, the ones that couldn't be disputed in a court of law. Holly's advice was cold and clinical, like a surgeon's scalpel. She told me that fighting a pig in the mud only gets you dirty while the pig enjoys it. Her plan was simple. Let Vanessa think she had won. Let her celebrate the change of command, while we quietly built a legal file so airtight the truth would become an inescapable weapon. As I looked at Briggs and then back at the screen, the hollowness in my chest began to fill with a cold, hard resolve. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs. But it was being pushed aside by a singular focus. I wasn't just a victim of a toxic family anymore. I was a soldier on a new kind of battlefield. I told Briggs that I would be going back to Fort Liberty in the morning, right into the heart of the ceremony, because I needed those original logs and I knew exactly where to find them. Our new headquarters was a far cry from the high-tech glass and steel offices of the Fort Liberty Command Center. It was a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of Fayetteville, tucked away between a body shop and a forgotten lumberyard. The air inside was thick with the smell of old grease, damp concrete, and the lingering scent of exhaust from the trucks outside. There was no air conditioning, only the rhythmic drone of a few rusted industrial fans that did little more than move the stagnant heat around. But as I stepped inside, I did not see the decay. I saw 22 men and women, the very best minds in cyber defense, working with a focus that was terrifying in its intensity. Rivera had rigged up a makeshift server cluster on a stack of reinforced cardboard boxes, his fingers flying across a keyboard as he monitored the local traffic. Briggs was in the corner, distributing a few boxes of cold Domino's pizza that he had picked up with the last of his personal cash. I asked him if this was really the grand debut of Sentinel Forge, trying to keep my voice from cracking as I looked at the meager surroundings. Briggs just grinned, handing me a lukewarm slice and telling me that it was a hell of a lot better than Vanessa's office because there was not a single trace of betrayal in the air here. I ate in silence, watching them. These were people who had walked away from steady paychecks and military pensions just to stand by me. They were the family that the universe had provided to fill the void left by my own flesh and blood. And for the first time in days, the crushing weight in my chest felt a little lighter. We could not just sit in that warehouse and hope for a miracle. I told the team that we needed the original system logs from the base. The cloud backups were useless because I knew Connor Wells would have already overwritten them with his own fabricated data. The only truth left was sitting on the physical hard drives in server room 4, deep within the heart of the base. Briggs shook his head, warning me that the military police had likely already been given orders to detain me if I showed my face anywhere near the perimeter. I looked down at the common access card in my hand, the plastic slightly warm from being pressed against my palm. I knew how the military's digital infrastructure worked. The central server took time to sync with the gate scanners. I calculated that I had roughly a 45-minute window before my credentials were flagged as invalid across the entire system. It was a desperate gamble, a choice between clearing my name or ending up in a federal holding cell for unauthorized entry. But as I looked at my team, I realized I had already lost everything else. The drive to the gate of Fort Liberty was the longest 10 minutes of my life. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, and my palms were so slick with sweat that I had to keep wiping them on my jeans just to hold the steering wheel steady. As I approached the checkpoint, I saw Corporal Miller standing guard. He was a young man, barely 20, whom I had mentored a year ago when he was struggling with his certification exams. He took my card, his eyes widening as he recognized my face. There was a flicker of confusion and hesitation in his expression, a silent acknowledgement of the rumors that had been tearing through the base all morning. I kept my voice as flat and professional as possible, telling him I was just there to return some equipment and clear out the last of my personal files. He hesitated for a heartbeat that felt like an hour, his gaze darting to the monitor in his booth. Then, without a word, he swiped the card. The scanner gave a sharp, electronic beep, and the light turned green. He handed the card back, his voice a low whisper as he told me to stay safe and good luck. It was a small act of loyalty, a quiet rebellion against the toxic leadership at the top. And it was the only reason the gate swung open. I moved through the corridors like a shadow, using the service tunnels and technical access points I had memorized over the years. When I finally reached the server room, the air was cold and filled with the high-pitched whine of thousands of processors. My fingers felt like lead as I accessed the root directory, my eyes scanning the file names until I found what I was looking for. It was a hidden folder labeled Termination Plan. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the creation date. It had been formatted 2 weeks ago. That was the weekend of my father's birthday party, the same night Vanessa had sat next to me on the porch, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about how proud she was of our family's legacy. While she was smiling at me and promising to always have my back, she was already coding the digital noose that would hang my career. The sheer, calculated coldness of it made my stomach turn. I copied the encrypted logs onto my USB drive, my hands shaking not with fear, but with a deep, visceral disgust for the woman I had once called my sister. I had the smoking gun now. Vanessa had not just made a mistake. She'd committed a crime of the heart, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. I felt the cold, hard edge of a resolve that would not break until every one of her lies was dragged into the light. Back in the safety of our dimly lit warehouse, the air felt heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the faint metallic tang of old computer hardware. Briggs and I sat hunched over my laptop, the screen illuminating our tired faces in a cold blue glow as we began the grim task of dissecting the files I had just retrieved. It felt less like a technical review and more like an autopsy of a relationship I once held sacred. As we scrolled through the chat logs between Vanessa and Lieutenant Wells, the sheer depth of the calculated malice began to reveal itself in stark black and white. I saw a message dated May 12th where Vanessa explicitly instructed Connor to start seeding errors into my efficiency reports. Then came the entry from May 14th, where she demanded that the cloud backups be wiped clean to ensure I had no ground to stand on before her upcoming promotion ceremony. A physical wave of nausea washed over me as I stared at that date. May 14th was the afternoon I'd spent 3 hours at the mall with her, patiently helping her choose the perfect navy dress for that very ceremony. I remembered her looking at me in the mirror, smiling that warm, practiced smile, and calling me her sweet little sister. At the very moment I was telling her how proud I was of her achievement, she was already finalizing the digital burial of my career. The premeditated nature of the betrayal felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. It wasn't just a professional disagreement, It was a character assassination carried out by someone who knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay. I leaned back in my chair, the plastic creaking in the silence of the warehouse, and thought about my father's rigid face at the dinner table. I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind, telling me that Vanessa only wanted what was best for me. The blind favoritism of my parents had acted as a fertile soil for the monster my sister had become. They had spent decades validating her ego while dismissing my efforts, and now their golden child was using that unearned power to destroy the one person who actually cared for her. Holly Whitman, my lawyer, looked at the logs over my shoulder and let out a sharp, breathy exhale. She noted that this went far beyond a simple dismissal. It was a criminal conspiracy that could send Vanessa to a military prison if the truth ever reached a courtroom. But I knew Vanessa was still holding all the cards at Fort Liberty, and she was the type of person who would burn the whole house down before she admitted to an error. Through the remote surveillance feed that Briggs had managed to keep active, we watched the scene unfolding inside the base command center. The atmosphere there looked frantic. Vanessa was pacing the floor like a caged animal, her movements jagged and uncoordinated as she barked orders at a visibly shaking Lieutenant Wells. Without my team to manage the intricate web of security protocols we had built, the system was starting to buckle under the weight of their incompetence. Error messages were flashing across the main displays in a frantic rhythm of red and amber. Vanessa looked like a child who had broken a complex toy and was now screaming at it to fix itself. I could see the panic in her eyes, the specific panic of a narcissist, realizing that her mask of perfection was about to shatter in front of her peers. Wells was stuttering, explaining that my security keys were too complex to bypass and that they didn't have the necessary administrative clearance to stabilize the grid. In a fit of pure, unadulterated arrogance, Vanessa grabbed a folder from the desk and slammed it against the console. I watched her lips move as she issued an order that made my blood run cold. She was demanding a force override. It was the ultimate technical taboo, a reckless move that bypassed every safety protocol we had installed to protect the base's infrastructure. To her, it was just a button that promised to restore her control. To us, it was the digital equivalent of cutting the brakes on a heavy truck while it was hurtling down a steep mountain pass. Briggs whispered that if she followed through with that command, the resulting surge would crash the entire power grid for 3 different bases. It wouldn't just be an office blackout. It would affect the military hospitals, the air traffic control systems, and the sensitive data storage facilities. Vanessa was so blinded by her need to erase the evidence of her fraud that she was willing to risk a national security disaster just to save face. She was choosing her own ego over the safety of thousands of people. As I watched her finger hover over the final confirmation key, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my career anymore. I was fighting to stop a woman who had lost all touch with reality from causing a catastrophe that could never be undone. The sister I loved was gone, replaced by a ghost of ambition that was about to pull the trigger on everyone around her. I watched the surveillance feed with a growing sense of dread that made my pulse hammer in my temples, a rhythmic thud that seemed to match the flickering of the red error lights on the screen. The warehouse was freezing, the smell of damp concrete and old copper wiring clinging to the air, but I was sweating through my shirt as I looked at Vanessa's face on the monitor. Briggs was standing behind me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on the display where my sister was about to pull the digital trigger on the entire base. He told me to just let it happen, to let her bury herself in the wreckage of her own arrogance and incompetence. He wanted me to enjoy the spectacle of her self-destruction, but I couldn't just sit there and watch the fire start. I thought about the men and women in the base hospital, the ones on ventilators and life support who relied on the very grid Vanessa was about to sacrifice for her ego. I felt a crushing sense of responsibility that transcended any rank or commission. Even though she had stripped the silver leaves from my shoulders, I was still the one who had built that house, and I couldn't bear to see it burn down with people inside. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen as I felt the weight of the ultimate humiliation. The act of subverting my own pride to beg a monster to act like a human being. I took a jagged, shaky breath and pressed the call button, listening to the hollow ring that sounded like a countdown. The line clicked open after 3 agonizing rings, and Vanessa's voice came through, jagged and sharp, dripping with a mixture of intense stress and pure, unadulterated venom. She didn't bother with a hello, she simply asked what I wanted and told me she was busy running her command, her voice crackling with the strain of a woman who knew she was losing control but refused to admit it. I kept my voice as steady as I possibly could, suppressing the waves of unresolved resentment that threatened to choke me as I spoke. I told her I was watching the system logs from the outside and begged her not to execute the force override. I tried to explain the technical fail-safes I'd spent years building into the architecture, the very ones she was too technically illiterate to understand. I warned her that if she pushed that button, she wouldn't just be erasing my digital fingerprints, she would be blacking out every sensitive facility at Fort Liberty and putting thousands of lives at risk. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line, and for a split second, I allowed myself to hope that the logic of a soldier might finally pierce through her thick, narcissistic armor. But then, a high-pitched, mocking laugh erupted from the speaker, a sound so cruel it made my skin crawl. She accused me of calling just to gloat, of trying to undermine her authority even after I'd been discarded like trash. Her voice rose into a jagged screech as she told me I was nothing more than a failed captain and a jealous, bitter sister. She started dragging up the ghosts of our childhood, throwing them at me like jagged stones meant to draw blood. She reminded me of the time I didn't make the cheerleading squad and how our parents had looked at me with that familiar, soul-crushing mix of pity and disappointment while she stood in the spotlight. She told me I had always been the ugly duckling, the disappointment of the Dean family, and that she was finally going to scrub the stain of my presence from her servers once and for all. I found myself shouting her name into the phone, my voice cracking with a desperate mixture of anger and a fading, dying hope. I told her this wasn't a game or some petty family feud. It was about the lives of the people we were sworn to protect. But Vanessa wasn't listening to logic or duty anymore. She was only listening to the screaming voice of her own insecurity and the pathological need to prove she was better than the sister she had spent a lifetime diminishing. She hissed into the phone that she knew exactly what she was doing and that she didn't need a lecture from a disgrace who was now a civilian nobody. I realized in that heart-wrenching moment that you cannot save someone who is determined to drown, especially when they are trying to use your head as a stepping stone. I felt something deep inside me snap. The last remaining tether of loyalty I had toward the woman who shared my DNA was finally severed. I transitioned from a state of wanting to help her to a cold, hard clarity that felt like ice in my veins. Through the speaker, I heard her turn away from the receiver and bark a sharp command at Lieutenant Wells to execute the override immediately. I tried to say one last thing, a final warning that she was walking off a cliff, but the call was cut off with a sharp, final click that echoed in the quiet warehouse. We both turned our eyes toward Briggs's monitor, our breaths held in our chests. The sea of flickering green icons and steady blue lines that represented the lifeblood of Fort Liberty suddenly turned a violent neon red. Then, one by one, the lights simply went out. The entire grid for the base went black, leaving nothing but a vast, empty void on the screen that reflected our own stunned faces. The system had crashed exactly as I knew it would, a casualty of the very pride Vanessa used as a shield against her own inadequacy. I slowly lowered my hand, the phone feeling like a heavy piece of lead as it slipped from my fingers onto the wooden desk. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the absolute silence of the warehouse wash over me, a silence that felt like the aftermath of a war. I had done everything in my power to prevent this catastrophe, and now the consequences and the darkness belonged entirely to her. I felt a strange sense of release, a quiet realization that my debt to that family was finally paid in full. The time for silence and for protecting her secrets was officially over. The darkness she had created in her arrogance was about to become the very spotlight that would expose her crimes to the entire world, and I was no longer afraid to let the light in. And I can tell you that my heart truly broke for Julia during that phone call. There is no deeper pain than being treated with cruelty and suspicion when you are offering a hand of safety to someone you love. Vanessa chose her ego over the safety of thousands, and now the entire base is paying the price for her unchecked arrogance. If you have ever reached a point in your life where you had to realize that you could no longer save someone who was determined to destroy you, please leave a broken heart emoji in the comments. It is a painful realization, but it is often the first and most necessary step toward finding your own peace. We are standing with you, Julia, as the darkness sets in. At 2:15 p.m., Judgment Day arrived early at Fort Liberty, but it did not come with fire or thunder. It came with a silence so absolute it was terrifying. From our flickering monitors in the warehouse, we watched the base's digital nervous system simply stop breathing. The radar at the airfield ceased its constant rhythmic rotation, leaving the skies blind. At the Womack Army Medical Center, the electronic health records vanished, forcing doctors to scramble for paper and pens while life-saving equipment transitioned to the dying hum of backup generators. In the center of the command room, Vanessa stood like a statue carved from ice, her face drained of all color as she stared at a wall of black screens. Wells was hunched over his keyboard, his fingers hitting the keys with a desperate, frantic energy that achieved nothing. Vanessa began to scream, her voice a shrill, jagged edge in the quiet room, demanding that he restart the system. But the machines did not fear her rank, and they did not care about her anger. Logic was the only language they spoke, and Vanessa had effectively executed that logic when she pushed the override button. The news of the blackout spread through the region like a wildfire, fueled by the terrifying realization of how fragile our infrastructure really was. On a small television in the corner of our warehouse, a CNN breaking news banner announced a major cyber incident at the nation's largest military installation. The pressure was mounting in real time. I watched through our hidden feed as Vanessa's private cell phone rang incessantly. Calls from the Pentagon and the 82nd Airborne Division commander that she was too cowardly to answer. Instead of finding a solution, she turned on her own, grabbing Lieutenant Wells by the collar and shaking him as she accused him of sabotaging her career. It was a pathetic display of a leader in total collapse, someone who had spent her life climbing a ladder only to find she had no idea how to stand on the roof once she got there. I watched her with a cold, detached pity, realizing that her pride had acted as a blindfold until the very second she walked off the cliff. My own phone began to vibrate against the wooden table, the caller ID flashing with Vanessa's name. I signaled for the team to be quiet and hit the speakerphone, letting her voice fill the warehouse. She didn't lead with an apology or a plea for help. She led with an accusation, her voice trembling with a volatile mixture of fear and unearned authority. She asked me what kind of virus I'd planted in her servers and ordered me to return to the base immediately to fix the mess, threatening me with federal prison if I refused. I leaned back in my chair, my voice calm and steady, a sharp contrast to her spiraling panic. I reminded her that she had fired me and escorted me off the premises less than 48 hours ago. I told her that I was now a civilian, a private citizen who no longer took orders from a colonel, especially one who had ignored every technical warning I had provided. I told her that she had made her choice to force the override, and now she had to live with the darkness she had invited in. The silence that followed was broken 5 minutes later by a much different call. This time the voice was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of true authority. It was Major General Anderson, the division commander. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or false accusations. He acknowledged that he knew exactly what had happened in that briefing room and that he wasn't interested in playing games while his soldiers were at risk. He told me he needed the system back online and that he needed the person who built it to do the job. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the shift in power as the 22 soldiers behind me stood a little straighter. I told him that my company, Sentinel Forge, was ready to assist, but that the mission would be handled on my terms. I made it clear that Vanessa Kincaid was to be removed from the server room and stripped of all technical oversight before I set foot on the base. I also told him that as a private contractor, my fee would be $500 an hour. For the first time, my value wasn't being measured by the silver leaves on my shoulders, but by the undeniable fact that I was the only person who knew how to turn the lights back on. 2 days after the lights finally came back on at Fort Liberty, I found myself walking down the long, linoleum-lined corridors of the administrative wing once again. This time, I wasn't wearing the camouflage that had been my second skin for 15 years. I had chosen a sharp, navy blue suit, a quiet declaration of independence from the hierarchy that had tried to erase me. My head was held high, not with the borrowed authority of a rank, but with the grounded confidence of a woman who finally understood that her worth was never something a promotion could grant or a sister could take away. As I entered the Inspector General's hearing room, the air felt sterilized and heavy with the scent of old paper and suppressed anxiety. Vanessa was already seated at the mahogany table, looking like a hollowed-out ghost of the woman who had fired me just days before. The stress of the total system failure and the impending investigation had aged her 10 years. Her eyes were sunken, and her fingers drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm against the wood that betrayed the terror hiding behind her cold exterior. Major Grant presided over the hearing, a man whose reputation for unwavering adherence to the Uniform Code of Military Justice meant that the time for family politics and manipulated narratives was officially over. Vanessa didn't wait for the proceedings to formally begin before she launched her final, desperate attack. Her voice was shrill and jagged, cutting through the quiet room as she accused me of being a disgruntled hacker who had planted a virus out of pure, bitter spite. She played the role of the devoted leader betrayed by a jealous younger sibling, leaning into a performance of righteous indignation that I recognized from 1,000 dinner tables in our past. I didn't interrupt her, and I didn't feel the need to defend my character with loud words. I simply sat there and let her talk until she ran out of air, watching as the officers on the board looked at her with a growing sense of discomfort. When she finally slumped back into her chair, I stood up and reached into my pocket for the small silver USB drive that held the weight of the absolute truth. I plugged it into the projector, and the room fell into a suffocating silence as the large screen flickered to life, displaying the encrypted chat logs we had retrieved from the physical servers. The logs were a digital autopsy of her premeditated malice. Every message she had sent to Lieutenant Wells, detailing exactly how to seed errors into my efficiency reports and how to ensure my career was buried before her promotion ceremony, was laid bare for the board to see. The silence in the room became heavy as the officers read the calculated betrayal in her own words, written at the same time she was smiling at me across our parents' kitchen table. But the final blow to her carefully constructed lie came when I played the audio recording of our last phone call. Vanessa's voice filled the room, sounding acerbic and filled with a terrifying disregard for the safety of the base. When the recording reached the point where she screamed that she didn't care about the fail-safes and that her command was the only thing that mattered, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was the sound of a leader choosing her own ego over the lives of her soldiers and the security of the nation. There was no way to spin those words as a misunderstanding or a mistake of the moment. The mask of the professional colonel finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Vanessa stood up, her face twisted in a mixture of blind rage and the specific, terrifying collapse of a narcissist who has lost her mirror. She began to sob, but the tears looked less like grief and more like the frustration of a trapped animal. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I had killed her, that I was destroying my own sister out of a lifelong resentment because I could never be her. I looked at her, not with anger or the satisfaction of a win, but with a profound and quiet pity. I told her that I hadn't destroyed her. She had done that to herself the moment she decided that her image was more important than the duty she swore to uphold and the family she was supposed to protect. I was simply the one who had turned the light on, so that everyone could finally see the rot she had been hiding in the shadows. Major Grant's voice was cold and final as he announced that Colonel Kincaid was to be suspended from all duties immediately, pending a full court-martial and criminal investigation. 2 military police officers stepped through the door, their presence a silent and heavy confirmation that the era of her manipulation was officially at an end. Vanessa struggled as they took her by the arms, her curses and insults echoing down the hallway until the heavy doors swung shut, leaving the hearing room in a sudden, peaceful stillness. Major General Anderson, who had been watching from the back of the room, walked toward me and offered his hand. He didn't offer a platitude, he simply looked me in the eye, thanked me for my integrity, and offered a sincere, heavy apology for the failure of the system to protect one of its own. As I shook his hand, I felt a weight that I had been carrying since I was a little girl finally evaporate into the air. I was no longer a victim of a toxic family or a scapegoat for an insecure sister. I was Julia Dean, a woman who had fought for the truth and won. And for the first time in my life, I could breathe without asking anyone for permission. I received a text message from my mother that simply said I needed to come home right away because they needed to talk. I knew exactly what was waiting for me behind the familiar white picket fence of our house in Hope Mills, a place that had once been my world, but now felt like a stage for a tragedy I no longer wanted to act in. The drive was quiet, the suburban streets of North Carolina looking identical to the day I left. But I was a different woman now, one who had seen the darkness behind the perfect military family facade. Vanessa had been forced into an early retirement to avoid a criminal trial, and while she kept her freedom, she had lost her pride, her rank, and her standing in the only world she ever cared about. When I walked through the front door, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with a heavy, misplaced grief that made the air feel hard to breathe. Vanessa was curled up on the floral sofa like a broken child, sobbing into a tissue while my mother stroked her hair with a level of tenderness I'd spent 30 years dreaming of for myself. My father was standing by the window, his back to the room, but the moment he heard my footsteps, he spun around with a face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated judgment. He did not ask if I was okay or how I had survived the last few days. He simply roared at me, asking how I could dare show my face after I had destroyed my sister and dragged the Dean name through the dirt. I stood there in the center of the living room, feeling the weight of their collective anger. But for the first time in my life, I did not feel the need to shrink or apologize for existing. I kept my voice low and steady as I looked at my father, telling him that I had not destroyed Vanessa, but that her own choices and her disregard for the safety of others had led her to this moment. I reminded them that she had almost caused a national disaster just to cover up a lie she had told to hurt me. My mother looked up then, her eyes red and filled with a desperate, blind loyalty to the child she had always favored. She told me that Vanessa was my sister and that family was supposed to protect each other no matter what. Then came the words that finally broke the last remaining tether of my heart. She suggested that since I was so talented and capable, I should have just taken the blame for her, that I could have found another career while Vanessa had lost everything she worked for. She wanted me to sacrifice my integrity to protect the rot that had been festering in our family for decades. And she said it with the same casual tone she used when asking me to pass the salt. In that moment, I looked at the three of them, the broken sister, the enabling mother, and the judging father. And I realized with a profound, quiet clarity that they were complete strangers to me. I did not feel the hot, searing anger I'd felt in the briefing room or the sharp bitterness of the dinner table weeks ago. I only felt a deep, hollow pity for people who would rather live in a comfortable lie than face the difficult truth. I realized that Vanessa was not the only one who was lost. They were all trapped in a cycle of favoritism and denial that I was finally choosing to leave behind. I told my mother, with a voice that did not shake, that I was done being the person they blamed for their own unhappiness. I told her that I would not apologize for being honest or for having the self-respect to stand up for the truth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my spare house key, the small piece of metal that had represented my permanent place in this home. I walked over to the side table and placed it down, the sharp sound of metal hitting wood echoing like a final period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. My father's voice followed me as I turned toward the door, a low growl telling me that if I walked out today, I would no longer be a part of this family and I would never be welcome back under his roof. I stopped at the threshold for a heartbeat, but I did not turn around to look at him. I told him that I had stopped being his daughter a long time ago, on the day he decided that Vanessa's image was more important than my reality. I stepped out onto the porch and into the cool night air, and for the first time in my life, the world felt vast and filled with possibility instead of being a narrow hallway of expectations. The wind was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and freedom. And as I walked to my car, I felt a weight evaporate from my shoulders that I had been carrying since I was a little girl. I got into the driver's seat and looked at the house in the rearview mirror one last time. The small glowing windows that once held my entire identity now looked like nothing more than a fading memory. I did not cry, because there were no tears left for people who did not want to be saved. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the remnants of that toxic history behind me and heading toward the only family I had left. The 22 people waiting in a warehouse who had proven that loyalty is earned through respect, not birthright. 6 months had passed since the storm had finally broken, and the morning sun now flooded the office of Sentinel Forge Labs in downtown Raleigh with a warm, natural light that felt like a physical benediction. This was a far cry from the damp, grease-stained warehouse where we had once huddled over makeshift servers in the dark. Our new headquarters was a space built on the foundation of transparency and mutual respect, filled with the steady hum of top-tier hardware and the quiet, focused energy of people who loved their work. We had just finalized a major security contract with the Pentagon, a deal that solidified our reputation as the gold standard in infrastructure protection. As I walked through the open floor plan, I saw my 22 original team members, the same men and women who had walked out of Fort Liberty with nothing but their honor, now leading our most critical departments. They were dressed in simple polo shirts with our company logo, laughing and collaborating without the rigid, fear-based hierarchy that had once defined our lives. Rivera stepped into my path, a folder in his hand and a genuine smile on his face, informing me that the representatives from Boeing were in the lobby and eager to meet. I smiled back and told him to let them know I would be there in 5 minutes. Before he turned away, I reminded him once again to stop calling me boss and to just call me Julia. Because in this new family we had built, we were all standing on the same level ground. The peaceful rhythm of my morning was momentarily interrupted by the sharp chime of my phone on the desk. I glanced down to see a text from a number I did not recognize, but the tone of the message made the sender's identity immediately clear. It was a plea for help, claiming that my mother was ill and needed surgery, and that Vanessa had no money left to contribute after losing her pension and her standing. I felt a brief, familiar pang in my chest, a ghost of the old pent-up bitterness that used to haunt my nights. But it was quickly replaced by a profound, quiet clarity. I remembered the dinner where they had asked me to sacrifice my soul for Vanessa's lie, and I realized that their cycle of manipulation was a game I no longer played. I did not feel the need to argue or seek revenge. I simply wanted to remain true to the person I had become. I forwarded the message to my personal assistant with a simple instruction to make a generous, anonymous donation directly to the hospital's billing department, ensuring that the surgery would be covered without them ever knowing where the money came from. It was my final act of kindness toward them, performed not because they deserved it, but because I refused to let their coldness turn me into someone I did not recognize. I then deleted the message and blocked the number, finally closing the book on a past that no longer had a hold on my future. I picked up my coffee mug, feeling the familiar, rough texture of the chipped handle against my palm. It was the same World's Oakest Captain mug that Rivera had handed me in the parking lot on the day my life fell apart. I had enough money now to buy the finest china in the world, but I kept this mug as a sacred relic of the journey. It was a reminder that resilience is not about remaining unbroken, but about finding a way to hold together even when the pieces have been shattered. Briggs walked into my office a moment later, carrying a small, vibrant oak sapling in a ceramic pot. He set it on the corner of my desk and told me it was a housewarming gift for the new office, noting that the tree was just as stubborn and resilient as I was. We shared a quiet laugh, the kind of honest, unburdened sound that can only come from a heart that is no longer hiding. I realized then that while I had lost a house and a title, I had gained a true home and a purpose that could never be taken away by a commission or a family decree. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city of Raleigh, the afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the streets below. On the flagpole in front of our building, the American flag was snapping proudly in the breeze. I no longer wore the uniform, and I no longer carried the rank of captain. But I knew with a deep, unshakable certainty that I was still serving my country in the most meaningful way possible. I was protecting the truth. I was looking after the soldiers who had risked everything for me, and most importantly, I had protected my own soul from the rod of hatred and resentment. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and whispered a quiet word of praise to myself for the distance I had traveled. I had gone through the fire and come out not as a victim, but as the architect of my own peace. I was Julia Dean, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Julia's journey teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of power and family. We often believe that we are defined by our bloodlines or the titles bestowed upon us by institutions, but real strength is found in our integrity. Julia's greatest victory was not seeing Vanessa fall. It was the moment she realized her value was independent of her parents' approval. She taught us that family is not just a matter of DNA, but a bond forged through mutual respect and shared truth. When you protect your soul from bitterness, you become truly unbreakable. I hope Julia's story has provided a sense of healing or a spark of strength for anyone currently navigating their own storm. If this story touched your heart or helped you find the courage to set your own boundaries, I would love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts or simply leave a comment below with your favorite part of her journey. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us reach others who might need to hear them. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join our community of resilient souls.